Mhm.
Hello, this is Leela Harris, and I'm here with Kindi Dulai-Gill, and we're doing an episode of our relationship series between Galleon Method facilitators, and today's episode is on intimacy. I received a topic request that I'm going to read that out loud, and that's how we're going to kind of start our discussion. So the message I was sent says, I am interested in the norm that says you should be in a romantic relationship, also in the need for space as well as intimacy and the stuff that relationships can bring up. Yeah.
The first part is that the norm of the fact that we're supposed to be in a relationship.
Yeah, it's interesting because this conversation, so we're coming from two totally different places between me and you, Kindi. I'm in my 40s. I never got married, never had kids. I had some short-term relationships in my life, but long-term relationships, you know, the way you've known it, hasn't been my experience. And you, how old were you when you got married?
23.
Yeah, so very different.
Yeah, and I've been married.
You've been with the same partner, just the one partner your whole life. Yeah.
31 years in this marriage. And I'm going to start with that phrase about it being the norm. Like, for example, when I grew up as a child, it was almost like a hypnotic thing to accept that I was being groomed to become a housewife and to get married. Like, culturally, it was just the accepted thing. And I remember having many private thoughts about the fact that I thought I didn't want to get married, but I could never reveal them because it was so alien to even have that thought. The idea that that's not what you really want for yourself. And then if you look around yourself, if I look back now in my life, so many things that were in the media or in the library books or in the fantasy fairy tales, they all gave you the impression that this again is the norm, that you have to have a partner, and unless you have a partner, something is missing for you. And so I suppose it isn't until much, much later in my life when I started to look at this more deeply that I began to see that somehow we slip into doing something because it's just the way it is for others around you, not necessarily the fact that it is what is best for you. It's very different, right?
Yeah.
And only last week I was reading something that Osho had said. Osho is a mystic from, he passed in, I think it was 1990, was it when he passed? But he's a very famous mystic that has left some very, very profound teachings. And he was talking about how his father wanted him to get married. And so his father also knew that if he asked the question directly, that he might get an answer that wasn't too palatable and he might not like the answer. So he tried to do it indirectly. And so he sent his wife off to go and talk to his son and to ask about, you know, is he ready to get married? And very, very interestingly, what Osho actually said to his mother was that I trust you implicitly, like absolutely and utterly and implicitly. And I think he gave her 2 weeks. I'm not exactly sure how much time frame he gave her. But he said, during this time frame, please evaluate whether you think marriage brings blissfulness, peace, ecstasy, joy to your life, and it adds something to your life that without which you would have been extremely miserable. And if you genuinely come back after this time frame to tell me that all these things, these blissful, ecstatic experiences are going to come out of marriage, then I trust you implicitly and it will be something I will definitely do. But it's in your hands to give me the honest answer in, I think it was 2 weeks. And 2 weeks later, the poor woman, I mean, she's his mother, right? And all she's now looking at is this lifetime of servitude, lifetime of serving the children. I think she had 10 or 11 children. A lifetime of arguments and misery and conflict and unsettled nature. So she couldn't wholeheartedly say to her son, yes, marriage brings you ecstasy. So she said, I actually take the question back. I'm not even going to ask you whether you want to get married, because you've vested so much trust inside me now that I can't be dishonest with you. Mm-hmm. And I only read that story only 2 weeks ago, or a week or so ago. And I find that so relevant to what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful story. And Osho is such a genius at getting to the heart of things.
Absolutely. I mean, there's more to that story as to how it carries on with other people, that his dad tries to persuade him to get married, and then eventually they all leave him be for him to decide in his own way that that isn't what he wanted for himself.
Yeah, and that comes down to also how people want to interfere, right, in our lives.
Yes.
And the pressure.
Yes.
Because it's based on what often they want, or, you know, like Osho's mother, not really necessarily feeling all this happiness from her marriage yet, needing to get her son to get married. Just, it's mechanical. It's almost like what you were talking about, the hypnosis, the programming, you have to get married.
Yes.
And that kind of thing.
And nobody's stopping back to actually evaluate and ask, okay, in society at large, I am seeing that the norm is that people come together, and the norm is that people are getting married, although in modern times less so in a lot of the civilized countries, in the westernized countries, I shouldn't say civilized countries. But despite that being the norm around you, nobody looks back and says, okay, the crowd is doing this, mm-hmm. but why are they doing it? And for what reason? And what is the upside of this? Nobody stops to actually go, okay, this is the matrix, but I'd like to understand the matrix. Is it necessarily good for me? Rather than it is the matrix and I'm running in towards it because it's just what everybody else is doing. So, and supposedly that's where my joy lies.
Yeah. And I remember I had a sibling. Actually, I had several people over my life ask me about having children, and kind of, you know, insinuating that I might regret it or that I'm missing something. And I remember my older sibling saying, you know, once you have children, don't worry, you'll love them.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And it's, you know, maybe it was an amazing experience for her, but it just amazes me to imagine that someone's like, don't worry, just have them. And then doesn't matter what you think.
Yes.
And yeah, and I think a little bit is the same for marriage as well. And I know my father, my mother was really free in letting me decide.
Yeah.
My father's very traditional, and he was raised in his Muslim family and quite traditional. In fact, on that side of the family, I remember I was visiting in the Middle East, and I had a cousin that wasn't there, but I was asking about her and how she's doing and that kind of thing, and asking one of my other cousins. And I said, how old is she? And they kind of went, shh. And I didn't understand. And then later, my cousin took me aside and said, she's 26, but we don't talk about that because she's not married.
Mm.
Yeah.
Because that's
a different culture. I wasn't raised most of my life in that culture, and I felt really grateful to not have that kind of pressure and that kind of like kind of shame about that. But my father did question me up till about my mid-30s. And then I think he gave up, like, okay, like, what are you doing here? Are you going to get married? I think he struggled with that and then just finally let it go.
But was it a conscious decision on your part that was not something you wanted, or is it something that's just unfolded naturally?
As I got into my late 20s, I started to realize I don't really know if I want marriage. And then as time went by, it just felt like, you know, I don't feel like I need it. Yeah. So at first it was kind of like not necessarily a conscious decision, but yet unconsciously I was avoiding it in some way because it just never worked out. But I think it just wasn't for me. But I remember as a kid, I'm trying to think of that whole Cinderella fairy tale kind of thing. I think just like all kids, I was a little bit in that.
Mm.
Maybe not as much as a lot of other little girls. Maybe it wasn't as much a fixation. It was just around me. I think it didn't have as strong a hold of me as it did you, Kindi, because the cultural influences were everywhere around you.
Yeah, for me, I think the contemplation of stepping outside of what the culture was doing would have been way too big a leap for me at that point, because I simply didn't have the courage to stand up against the culture. And that's what it comes down to in some ways. When we don't do what is in the norm, it requires us to have a degree of courage to step against what is in the norm. And so often many people will follow what is the norm, not necessarily because it is right for them, but because they don't have the strength to stand against a mass population that's behaving in a certain way. And so fear comes in. And we don't look at that. We don't look at, oh, thousands and thousands of people are doing all of this, therefore it must be right. No, it's not. It could be that thousands and thousands of people are doing something because they're too scared to stand against it, and therefore they fell into it because it was the only thing, it was the only other option. So, and that's the pull of the norm. The norm is extremely heavy and it's extremely strong. And it has a gravity of its own that sort of sucks you in like quicksand. And the only thing that helps you to stand outside of it is the ability to have the courage to stand against it.
Yeah. So for the person to ask the question, or anybody watching this, anytime we're experiencing that conflict of the pressure, the outer pressure that this is what's wanted and I'm not sure, or sometimes we don't even know because the confusion of the pressure, we don't even have the space to even be able to make a clear decision. But to do that inner work or get the support or whatever is needed, to take that time and take it really seriously that you're in that experience and working through the fears, working through the insecurities, because then the strength can come where it becomes pretty, like for me, it's like not even a question that I don't follow all these social norms, especially even 5 years ago. I mean, I used to go along with a lot of things that now I easily just say no to, or I walk away from, or I don't participate in. And what it does for your life, for your feeling of, I don't know, how would you call it, Kindi, when you're honoring your own truth, and even though it disappoints those around you, what would you call the benefit of that experience for yourself?
It's actually a degree, like it's the moment where there's an element of self-respect and an integration that happens inside you, where you just know that at last you're doing what is right for you. And therefore, when you take yourself to bed, or when you sit on the sofa, or when you make another decision after that, you actually feel a subtle sort of joy from inside, just because you are who you are and you acknowledged what was right for you, even if it is something that's against what other people would have wanted. I mean, like last week or the week before, actually probably an element of both weeks, I was going through a phase where there was a lot of vertigo in my life. So I'd wake up in the morning and things would just be spinning around me, and I couldn't concentrate into a computer screen. And when I sat down, I felt very vomity, as if I was going to throw up. Like that nauseousness was there around me all the time. And at the same time, a sense of doom and gloom that sort of like grabbed me, as if this sort of like huge depressive state just took over my physical body. But yet, despite the fact that I was feeling like that, I was supposed to, like the norm, the norm is that when the authority has spoken, you're supposed to do what the authority has said. And I have a client that I'm going to be speaking for next week. And they wanted the presentation slides to be given to them on October the 10th. And October 10th came and went, and I was not capable of producing them. And there was this sense of, oh, all of the other speakers will have sent their stuff in. And so the norm is to do what the client is asking you to do. But here, and the client is paying, but here I am incapable of delivering what the client is asking me. So how am I going to deal with that? And I actually did end up just acknowledging, I feel too sick. I'm incapable of producing this work. When I'm ready and my physical state is capable of letting me do so, I'll start preparing them. But until then, I can't push myself or force myself to do something that's not good for me. And I'm 54 years old, and that was a massive decision to get to 54 years old and decide that I had to do what was right for me, even though the norm is that you have to do what the client is asking you to do. And I spoke with the client on Friday. That's yesterday, isn't it? Yeah. I spoke with the client on Friday and explained a little about what had happened and why I wasn't able to do what he had asked for. And he was so receptive and so accepting and so gracious around my inability to do what I needed to do for him, because he had already built in slack in his time frame, and I intuitively had sort of connected with that and knew that there was slack. But it shows you that I could have done something that the norm says should happen to keep him happy, but it would have meant that actually I was going to compromise me.
So that brings up another thing about keeping people happy. How's that different than, so we talked about, we're going to probably call this episode intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
So to keep people happy, and that doesn't create intimacy, does it? So you had this moment of connection with this person because you were honest, instead of trying to please them or trying to meet their expectations. It was kind of more of like speaking from, you know, your authenticity, or maybe you would say from the heart.
Yeah.
And I think that when people are pressuring us, or when they have the social pressures, or people are pushing our buttons, I know for me, it's been there to push me to find that place in myself and speak up for myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
we feel obligated and we feel like we're responsible, we've got to be dutiful or whatever. We're putting pressure on ourselves to be something that is not necessary. I mean, there are times when what you're being asked to do is actually what you want to do, or when somebody's saying something and it's actually something you want to participate in. Like, for example, today we're creating this video, but 10 minutes before we were scheduled to come together, Narava couldn't come and join us. And so even though these videos are for educational reasons, and the more people that are on these videos, the wider the perspective, still there would be something missing if she had come today to talk when her psyche wasn't ready to or couldn't.
mm-hmm.
And so that's the piece that we constantly keep forgetting, is that when we show up, when we're not really willing or wanting to show up, or we can't, then we're bringing a part of ourselves into that conversation that isn't even alive. Like, you're not even all there. So it's like you're bringing something of you into a situation that isn't going to do you any good or the people around you any good. Like with the idea of intimacy, like I remember as a younger child, I would think, okay, Valentine's Day means my husband has to buy me a card, or Valentine's Day means I have to receive a bunch of flowers, or Valentine's means I'm going to get a nice gift, or I'm going to go out for a nice meal. Like, so then commercially, intimacy has been turned into, you're supposed to receive this and you're supposed to get that, and you're expecting, and there's an obligation, and you're waiting. So what's happened is intimacy has actually been destroyed because of all these obligations and expectations and rules and codes of conduct that a person has to live by. Whereas if you just give a person freedom to be themselves, that's about the most intimate exchange you can have with
And that
any.
experience is so different than, as I listened to you describe the Valentine's Day thing, I could feel the difference in that feeling than when you're just having that presence with someone, or that connection with someone that's based on more honesty and being ourselves and not trying to live out a formula.
That's right.
And I think a lot of intimate relationships are kind of stifled under the pressure of trying to fulfill the fantasy of another person and then expecting them to fulfill our fantasy, where I wonder how many people stay together for years or their whole lives and they never really know each other because that's all they've done.
Yeah, it's difficult to know each other because you are, if you're in a dependent situation, a codependent situation, because fear is still driving your interactions, the fear to show yourself in your true nakedness, not like in the nakedness necessarily physically, but in your true nakedness of who you are. The fear to show or reveal all of that is what stops us from being intimate.
Yeah, and we'll do one video probably on the subject of sex. We're not going to go into sex on this one because that deserves its own topic. But I think this intimacy that we're talking about, in order to have that connection during sexual intimacy, I think it all ties in. Let me go back on that question. So she also talks about the need for space as well as intimacy.
Right.
So as far as the need for space, so I talked about how I've been kind of more just really free, and as far as relationships and I mean, as compared to the traditions, like what we just compared our upbringing and my father's family. And but I have seen where I would just kind of ditch the relationship really fast because so my inability to create intimacy, because I didn't even know how to do it with myself, much less another person. When things didn't feel good, I would just kind of end the relationship. This was much earlier on in my life, because I needed space and I didn't know how to speak up for myself. I didn't know how to ask for what I wanted. So I would try to please the person. And then of course I wasn't happy. So then I would want to leave the relationship in order to get space. Yeah. So I've had to really work on understanding that relationships aren't bondage.
Yes.
And because I have to take responsibility for, if something doesn't make me happy, I have to have the conversation. And, you know, the hard work, it's like so I wanted to bring that aspect in, that there's the running away from intimacy as well. And of course we deserve space and everyone needs their time alone, but that usually depends on us, like working through something in us in order to find that in the relationship.
Yeah, and it also comes back to what you said earlier, that if you didn't know how to be intimate with yourself, then how could you be intimate in a relationship with somebody else? Well, space is similar as well. If we are not capable of being settled in the space that's inside us, like that just sort of nothingness, if we're not capable of being in that space, we're not capable of creating space for anybody else or for ourselves in the external world either. So a lot of the times what happens is that, like for example, take me. I've been in this marriage for a very long time. The early part of my marriage was nothing but need. Like it was just full of need. It was just an obsessive sense of being scared of my own company, being scared to be alone, and therefore needing something to avoid me having to be alone or to avoid me being in my own company. And then that need means that you can't offer the person any space or yourself any space. So if I was away, and I or my husband was away, there'd be that thing about like needing him back. So it was constantly about not wanting the space.
Mm-hmm.
And then as time went on and I started doing this inner work with Madda and with the Dalian method and learning how these needs are like almost like energetic leakages inside you, plus like a vampire from the person that you're trying to get from all the time. And it's actually it's so hard to cope with a person who's extremely needy, because you want to slap them and sort of push them on their way, right? So when I started to see all that nature, it was easier to give my husband space to do his own thing. Whereas before, if he was doing his own thing, I would label it, oh, he's in his man cave, or he's hiding, or I'm on my own and boo-hoo, and I'm feeling like a victim, and I'm feeling sad for myself. But now it's like giving him space to be free to live his life means that there is space for me to live my life. And so that's the piece I hadn't even seen before, is that I wasn't even giving myself space to live. Like, so in that question, it's almost like the more comfortable you become with yourself, the more you enjoy your own company, the more willing you are to take your space and honor your individuality and your individual space. And then you do it for other people too. And because you do it for other people too, then room gets made for them to want to do more for you if they do want to, because there's now space. There's movement, and there's something possible back and forth rather than clinging and needing. But it's not an easy thing to have to see all these things about ourselves, that often we want to be in relationships or we want to be in an intimate setting because we're too scared to be on our own. And we think there's something's missing if we're just with ourselves.
Yeah. So how long were you married before you started doing this work and realizing those dynamics inside of you?
I've been married 21-ish years, 20-ish years. And prior to doing this work, my solution would have been very fixed. Like, it was a very head-based solution. A little bit like how you just mentioned earlier. So if something wasn't working, you would let the relationship go and run, right? So if something wasn't working in the relationship for me, what I would say, I'd come up with a rule. I'd come up with a rigid rule that would say, well, unless this is happening, I'm not going to do da-da-da-da-da, right? To control it. Or my head would come up with a different idea, and that is it. That's it. I'm going to have to leave. I'm going to have to get divorced. I'm going to have to get out. Because they were the only solutions that the mind can come up with. It'll either control something with a rule, or it will say, I need to get out.
Yeah, and there's also running away from the vulnerability, and either I'm going to control them or I'm going to leave them.
Yes.
Because there's a feeling that the ego's in control, like I'm going to leave you.
Yeah.
And because of there's something going on inside, there's a pain inside, and we don't want to feel it.
You don't want to feel it.
The reason I asked you how long you were married, because sometimes people think it's been too long. I've been in these patterns too long. It's never too late, actually, and to turn things around. So in my experience, I've learned through several relationships in my life, and Kindi has learned through the same relationship, and that relationship itself has changed dynamics within that. So either one, it works, whatever works for each person is different, but either one can work within transforming what's the relationship is showing us and pushing us to see in ourselves.
And also to see that what we deem to be unfixable cannot be cured. The only answer is to walk away. And we label things as, this is a bad human being, and we don't work together, and I have to shut the door on you, like all those type of things. I actually listened to my first session with Madda 2 days ago, because I'm preparing for this presentation. I wanted a benchmark of I wanted to know my starting point and where I've got to now, so that I could get a better sense of some of the audience that will be there, because they'll be in a similar space to my starting point. So I listened to my very first session, which was the 10th of October, 2008. And at the end of that session, Mara says to me, she goes, "Your marriage is not doing too well." And which was probably an understatement in the way that she said it, right? And she says, "I just want you to know that there is room. I just want you to know that you will manage." That's what she said. "Because there's an openness in you to grow, and there is an openness in him to grow too. And you will manage, because mutual respect and understanding can flow if you use this marriage now as a tool for personal development." And I am now 10 years on in that same marriage. And I'm shocked at the level of peace that resides in it, the quality of the intimate conversations that go on, in terms of the honesty of what's revealed from me, or the honesty that's revealed from him, the space that we offer each other, the freedom that we have to live our lives whilst we cohabit. It's almost like fairy dust got thrown on us. Because how was that possible for a marriage that wasn't doing so well 10 years ago? Mm-hmm. And it just goes to show us the power of what it is that we're supposed to learn in our human interactions. So having said everything that we said about the fact that, it takes courage to stand against the norm, and it takes courage to not do what society is doing in general, all relationships are there to teach us something about ourselves. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be in the form of a marriage and or otherwise. And it doesn't have to be that you have to avoid marriage. But any human being that is in your life is going to reveal something for us about ourselves that is going to benefit us in our own growth, if we're willing to put the attention back the other way. So as long as we're willing to go, okay, what is this relationship or the interaction teaching me about me? Yeah. So I'm not an advocate for saying let's avoid marriage, because if I'd avoided marriage, I really wouldn't be where I am right now.
Yeah. And I just want to say, because we're getting to the end, so also because of the transformational aspect of relationships and people, and also being alone, because I've been kind of forced to spend a lot of time single and being alone. It just hasn't worked. And it was because, for me, I have an aspect of myself that really wants to pour myself into relationships. That's just been something, my sense is past lives. That's been my focus. Relationships, how do we work on that? And so I needed to take several years actually to focus in and find out who I am. So I've been pushed to kind of be alone in that sense. So for people who feel like you can't seem to have a relationship or it doesn't work out, also like looking at those problems that we talked about, but also that maybe you're not meant to be hooked to a partner. Maybe that's not right for you, because there may be something else that you need to learn, or maybe that your soul needs to experience. I know I've been learning how to stand on my own without someone kind of being there as a support, which is actually really incredible, but I would have never guessed that it would be fulfilling or incredible, because I was so attached to relationships. So yeah. So any final thoughts?
That even if you're in a marriage and you do have a companion, you still have to have that same experience you're describing, and that is to learn what it means to be alone.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, good point.
Because it doesn't mean that you avoid that at all. It doesn't matter what angle we come from. Ultimately, we all end up learning similar things. So my biggest learning really in this marriage has been to accept my aloneness, and to understand what that means, and to be willing to be alone. So you've lived through more of that because by nature it's happened automatically.
Yeah, but I'm bad at it. I'm still working at connecting to my aloneness and accepting it because there's so many ways to avoid it as well. But yeah.
And I've avoided it too by being in the relationship, and you know, it's a fear that still has to be overcome by all of us, literally. Yeah, married or not.
Great, we'll end it there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kindi.
Bye, everybody.